The federal deficit does not matter. Video number 5, subtitle Belly Flop. This is a revised version. P.O.F.O.S.I.E. In this fifth video, we're going to deal with the very serious business of our federal employees lying to we the people, and we're going to do it in a somewhat comedic way. And even though they are all saying the same lie, we will focus mainly, though not entirely, on President Donald John Trump. This has the potential to be a lot of fun from our position, and if done properly, our federal employees will be terribly embarrassed, as well they should be. To begin, imagine in your mind's eye the image of President Donald taking a swan dive leap from a high dive platform, then doing a 360 forward spin, and then going spread eagle with his ultimate intent of doing a belly flop into the pool below. He is airborne, being fully dressed in a nice suit and stylish shoes, white shirt, and of course the obligatory red tie that is streaming in the air over his left shoulder. However, in this mental image, and for goodness sake, we are just talking about a mental image, so in this case his hair is not mussed. Just a slight fluttering in the wind as every hair remains in place, and naturally he has that big old Trump smile from ear to ear. You folks on the left may lean toward a more perilous, more panic scenario, rendering you less able to more fully appreciate the sudden stop, in my opinion. And why in the world would our president do such a foolish stunt, you may ask? And the answer is because he thinks he can do it and get away with it, which is the parable being related in relation to why would he and a lot of other politicians lie to we the people by not telling us outright that the federal deficit is irrelevant. And it is because they too think they can get away with it, and so far they have, while ignoring the time-proven fact that actions have consequences. Anyways, before we get to that awakening moment, we will leave our hero or villain, you make the choice, and still in your mind's eye, in his free fall state as we thicken the plot with some salient facts, beginning with former President George W. Bush and former Vice President Dick Cheney both being on the public record as stating, and I quote, "The deficit does not matter," end quote, and they made these statements as far back as 2008. Then we have insult added to we the people's injury by having former President Obama as well as our President Trump by their fiscal policies, which have in the past and are now being presided over, have and are respectively stating that the federal deficit is irrelevant, though not stating same verbally, as we should all be painfully aware. And now we have the Consolidated Appropriations Act 2018, signed into law by our intrepid diver, President Donald, that reportedly will add $4 trillion to our irrelevant federal deficit over the next 10 years, so we know for sure that there will be no such thing as even mentioning anything about the farce of a balanced budget for these next 10 years. Still, our federal employees are a daring crowd, and this daring has them so emboldened that they may actually further insult our intelligence by making a statement about balancing the budget. We'll just have to wait and see, but don't be surprised, because they really do see we the people as being a bunch of children or dolts or both, as previously stated in video number 2. And don't forget that the tightly controlled corporate fake news media, which includes Fox News as far as this subject goes, will only report on what they're told to report on. And the obvious to everyone fact by now is that you never, ever talk about the federal deficit being irrelevant, or you will be immediately punished by being labeled as a socialist or a communist or both. And at this time, let's do a little refresher by refocusing our mental image as our hero or villain continues his descent. His tie is still trailing in the wind, his hair being gently buffeted despite the acceleration, and he is nonchalantly looking round with not the least bit of concern for the aforementioned sudden stop that is inevitable. At this point, perhaps we should add a little structure to our story and mind's eye image by stating the obvious, which is that it is crazy to do a full spread eagle belly flop into a pool from a high dive platform, never mind being fully clothed in a suit and tie and nice shoes and all the rest. And let's not forget the totally inappropriate smile, for goodness sake, which is to reflect on the absurdity illustrated in our type of metaphor or parable that is about President Donald John Trump's bullheadedness when it comes to continuing his denial in public of the federal deficit being irrelevant. Then, of course, we're talking about the belly flop having the sudden stop at the end of his dive, or more succinctly, the possible sudden disclosure by the Democrats that the federal deficit is indeed irrelevant, or the splat part of the dive, and we'll get to that. Anyways, during this same basic time period, we have the Consolidated Appropriations Act 2018, which again will add $4 trillion to our irrelevant deficit over the next 10 years. We had the Emergency Spending Bill in this same year, which resulted in the government shutdown, with the amount being for approximately $1 trillion, and we're talking about electronically generated federal monies, which is we the people's monies, not federal income tax monies, for both the Consolidated Appropriations Act 2018 and the Emergency Spending Bill, which dollar amount was rarely mentioned during this whole episode of both bills and the government shutdown. The fake news media, and again including Fox News, focused on the shutdown, not the electronically generated monies involved, and our president, who promised to never lie to us, went along with the whole thing. That being stated, let's add a little acceleration to our president's dissent by pointing out some facts having to do with our federal deficit being irrelevant. The amount of our federal deficit is now at $21.4 trillion, or $22 trillion, or perhaps the early 2020 figure of $23 trillion, depending on your source, which, by the way, is ludicrous, since we have no way of really knowing what our actual deficit is until there is an audit of the Federal Reserve Bank as related to we the people's ownership in part, and you don't want to get me started on this facet of the whole affair. Rather, it would be better if you were to read my book, the revised second edition, titled All About Equity Spending with the Love Story. Everything is pretty much covered there. Now to continue. There is a Professor Skidmore and his economics students at MSU who have reportedly discovered $21 trillion during the time period of 1998 through 2015 of unaccounted for monies in the DOD, which is antimony for the Pentagon and also the HUD so-called budget. And as it is stated as being unaccounted for, one must assume that this money is over and above the yet again $21.4 or $22 trillion or more, with this early 2020 $23 trillion figure for our federal deficit, not debt, that our federal employees will admit to. And yes, all of this kind of stuff is boring to some people, which should be ameliorated by knowing that we are building to a crescendo and a dramatic climax. So stay with me, please. Then there was or is another $9 trillion unaccounted for in the Pentagon budget since the 70s, which inversely is antimony for the DOD, and this figure has grown to $10 trillion by one report back in 2019, and who knows what it will be in 2020. And to be fair, some of these monies could be included in Professor Skidmore's accounting, and still we have no way of knowing until the audit of the Fed, which, by the way, was another campaign promise made by our president that is as yet unfulfilled. While keeping the mental image of our free-falling president in mind, let's do the math. We have $4 trillion that will more than likely turn into $10 trillion or more over the next 10 years as a result of the Consolidated Appropriations Act 2018. We have the probable $23 trillion for our current federal deficit here in early 2020, not debt. And please review my previous 4 videos for the more in-depth explanation about the fact that we don't really have a national debt. Then there is the $21 trillion Professor Skidmore has discovered, and we'll include in this amount the $10 trillion unaccounted for in the Pentagon budget, even though that accounting went back through the 70s, while Professor Skidmore's only went back to 1998, and these are just the monies that can be found. Anyone who has even a cursory understanding of accounting, which is the majority of we the people, knows what I'm talking about and can do the math. We have $54 trillion if we are including the 10-year time frame for the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2018. And since we usually have a yearly $1 trillion in additional deficit spending on top of all the other spending bills, no matter the projection, we're talking about the foreseeable 10-year future having a federal deficit of at least $64 trillion, which we all know could be a lot more, and please keep in mind that we are talking about a federal deficit, not a federal debt. With all being explained in my book, the revised second edition, short titled Equity Spending, which presents a greater panorama of the entire matter while keeping in mind that our free-falling president, a world-renowned businessman, entrepreneur, the master of the deal, is still insisting on refusing to tell we the people the truth about our federal deficit being totally irrelevant despite these overwhelming facts. In other words, he seems to think that he and the rest of the Capitol Hill crowd, including both parties, can keep lying forever. Except here comes the 2020 presidential election, and Congresswoman Nancy Pelosi and her party's 10 different strategies planned for winning back the White House, of which she will divulge 9, but what about that 10th strategy? What if, and keep the free-falling mental image of our president in mind, she and the entire Democratic Party decides to come clean and tell we the people the truth about the federal deficit being irrelevant, and that with this disclosure they intend to make amends for these many years of lying by proposing the electronic generation of federal funds to provide for a Medicare for All health care program, which of course means no cost or out-of-pocket expense for anyone, and this is just the beginning. As proposed in my 4th video, Representative Pelosi could also bring our nation's educational system from preschool to PhD, as well as the nation's prison system, if not privatized, under the federal umbrella for payment and limited supervision, not total control. At this point in time, you would hear a great big loud splat, and that splat would be our president doing his long time now initiated belly flop into the pool of reality. It won't hurt him so much as a person, but depending on the timing and other strategies, he could be dead politically, unless, of course, he tells his economic advisors before this momentous event to shut the heck up, and then does the right thing by being the first to tell we the people the truth about our federal deficit being irrelevant, and with him also coming forward with the 4 stated proposals for health care, prisons, if not privatized, and education. Then, metaphorically speaking, he would be, in effect, pulling the ripcord that would deploy his concealed parachute, custom built, into his suit jacket, providing for a safe descent to the astonishment and admiration of all, and this is metaphorically speaking. Reality-wise, he would have some explaining to do as to why he has waited so long to tell we the American people the truth, and he will most likely think of something. If it were me, I'd blame Larry. Afterwards, we are talking about an absolute certainty that he would then be reelected, and probably by the greatest margin ever recorded in the history of our nation. The question now is, will our president keep lying to we the people, or will he do the math in relation to our irrelevant federal deficit and the inevitable future projections for same, and simply determine that it is time for disclosure? It doesn't look good for our president, and if he chooses to keep lying, we'll be able to hear the splat from here in Tampa. My name is Oscar Dean Wyndham. Please read my book, the revised second edition, titled All About Equity Spending with a Love Story, and you should note that it is not even remotely like you may be imagining it to be. It is truly one of the most unique books you will ever read, and when the first edition came out in June of 2012, it was then, and probably still is, the only book in the entire world that describes in detail what is going on behind the scenes as far as our federal deficit being irrelevant. In future videos, the goings-on in the land of Lenoislid will be reported on, and this can't be fully explained for the sake of those who haven't read my book. Video number 5 transcript is available on my Facebook page, P.O.O.F.O.S.I.E.